I'm the director of the Stonewall National Museum and Archives, and we're very happy to have all of you here. And I am very happy to have my guest this evening, who is Minnie Bruce Pratt. Hello, Pratt. Hello, Minnie Bruce. How are you?
Hey there, Hunter. Glad to be here.
Nice to have you here, and I'm very much looking forward to talking with you about your new book of poems, Magnified, which we have right here. And so we're going to talk a little bit about life as an activist and life as a poet in the book, and you're going to read some poems this evening, and so I think that's great. And so thank you very much for your time. For those of you who, if this is your first time with Stonewall, hello and welcome. We started this series a little over a year ago. This is probably episode number 59. And it's been a wonderful series in which we've been able to bring artists and writers from literally around the globe to talk about poetry, fiction, non-fiction, visual art, critical thinking, and it's really been a great series. The way we do it is that if you are here, we would love to have your comments and questions. Just drop them into either the chat or the Q&A, and we will get to them. Minnie Bruce and I will be talking, and then we'll be doing some reading, but we will definitely be keeping an eye on the things that you ask, and we will try to get to those along the way. A little bit about Stonewall. Stonewall was founded in 1973, and the library has 28,000 volumes in it. And it's believed to be the largest LGBTQ library in the United States, if not the world, if not the solar system. I don't really know who keeps kind of things, but so it is. It's all arranged under the Library of Congress system. Many thanks to our chief librarian, Robert Lee, who does an amazing job. And we're working very hard to diversify what's going on in there. We just brought in all the Lambda Literary Award winners, and so that's been great. And so if you have books that you would like to donate to us, many books, or most of our books, do come from donations, and so please feel free to send them along. You can actually search our catalog by going to our website at stonewall-museum.org. And it's a wonderful way for anybody doing research. I hear from people all the time that are doing research, and so they go to our card catalog and find a variety of topics that are the books related to a particular topic. And there are also some study guides available on the website as well too, and so you can pick out anything from disco to Black criticism to feminism to pick the topic. There are probably 30 topics there. And they've actually have been condensed, and there's a whole reading list associated with those. And they're not definitive lists, they're not meant to be, but they're meant to be a way for you to start doing research there. So in addition to the library, we have an archive, and the archive is 2,700 linear feet. It totals about 6 million pages of LGBTQ history, primarily from 1950 to the present day. In the beginning, I've been there for about 2 years. In the beginning, I didn't really know what 2,700 linear feet was, but that would take you all the way up one side of the Empire State Building and all the way down the other. So it's like an amazing, it's an amazing trove. And we just recently received a wonderful grant from the Mellon Foundation, and so we're beginning to digitize the collection, so it will be available for people. And of course, if you're interested in working on a project, we have researchers there every week now, and so all you have to do is contact us, and we'll be happy to arrange your time and to talk about your research. Even if you're not here, we certainly do help people with research from a distance. In addition to those two big elements, we do exhibitions, and the exhibitions are pulled from the archives. It's a wonderful way for us to find LGBTQ themes and tie them back to the archives and put them up on the wall for people to see them. So the two shows we have up right now, one is called Don't Ask, Do Tell, which is the 225-year history between the US military and the LGBTQ community. And it's a fascinating examination, starting all the way from George Washington to Joe Biden, and it's shocking, although it shouldn't be, but it's shocking to see that in that entire 225 years, there is a little sliver of time during the Obama years, and then right now during the Biden years, in which there's been complete acceptance between the U.S. military and all members of the LGBTQ community. So it's a great way of being able to see it. You'll see artifacts, original documents put out by the U.S. By the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the Secretary of the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, telling them how to prosecute homosexuals, even if they weren't actually caught together, even if someone was just was suspected to be homosexual. And some of the suspicions about somebody being homosexual were not just what they said, it was whether or not somebody put out gender which was inconsistent with what they thought men should put out a particular type of gender, or women should put out a particular type of gender. That in and of itself, just the fact that a woman might appear more masculine or that a man might appear more feminine, that was enough to actually be discharged. Fascinating to look at the fact that is, within our recent history. The other thing that I find fascinating about that show is there's a full page ad from USA Today in April of 1993, where you have no one other than Colin Powell saying allowing gays in the military would destroy the United States military, destroy it. And to think we had such power that gays could actually destroy the military is really just farcical when you think about it. The other show we have up right now is also called Off Our Backs, and it's looking at lesbian publications from 1950 to 2000. And what I love about that show, particularly in comparison to a lot of the gay male serials that we have, is that in that period of time with things like The Ladder or Broomstick or Sisters or Lavender Women, Chrysalis, with a lot of those great serials, women were speaking about things entirely different than what men were. Gay men were talking about objectification of themselves and others and sex and a lot of other crazy stuff. But women were talking for a large part about building community, sexual autonomy, developing identity. There were a lot of feminist issues that were embedded and baked in those serials. And so it's a fascinating show. So anyway, everything about Stonewall, you can find at stonewall-museum.org. If you have somebody who might be interested in tonight's talk and aren't able to make it, we are live streaming this on Facebook, and so people will be able to see it there. Hello to everybody out there at Facebook. Thank you for all your support. And then also, if you give us about 72 hours, it will be posted on our website, so people can just find it on the public programming page and be able to pull it down from there. One last thing I want to say, thanks to the R Fund Foundation, which is an LGBTQ foundation located here in Fort Lauderdale. And they're a community foundation, which is really very helpful to a lot of queer organizations down here. And they provide us with support for this program. In particular, they support this. They help us out with providing stipends to the artists who are here. So that's all of my stuff I have to get out of the way. And so, Minnie Bruce, where are we finding you this evening?
I have to unmute myself. I'm talking to you from Syracuse, New York.
Yeah. And so why is it that you're in Syracuse?
Yeah.
We're breaking
a job here. I got work here at one point. Are you, yeah, you know what? I'm going to move my computer.
Good.
Like you were doing.
I think it's me right now because I'm right next to the router, so maybe it's you.
So in case it's me,
We never know.
All right, let's give it another try. How about that?
Good.
I don't like this background as much, but but it may be a better connection.
There we
How's
go.
that go? How's that doing?
That's doing well. That's
Is it okay? Good. All right. So I'm talking to you from Syracuse, but as we were saying earlier when we were visiting, home is still in Alabama. I still have the house that I grew up in there, and I go back about 4 times a year for 2 or 3 weeks and write, and also see friends and do political work down there as well. So I'm really, I'm not a snowbird. I go at all times of the year. I go when it's really hot. I'm really from the South. It's still home.
Yeah. What are your favorite memories of growing up in the South?
Well, you know, the memories are complicated now. I'll say that one place that I loved going to was the farm that my great aunt Janie lived on, my cousin Ruth, and my grandma stayed with them a lot of the time. It was down in Choctaw County, and we called it Push. But the reason that it was called Push was because the actual name of the little community was Pushmataha, which of course is the great, great Choctaw diplomat and statesman and warrior, Pushmataha. And when I was growing up, I knew nothing about it except that it was where I loved to be in the summertime and out in the country. And part of what it has meant for me to become a political person and really become a Southerner with consciousness is to understand where that land came from, what my people were really doing when they took this land, what happened to the people, the first peoples who lived there, how many of them are still there. You know, even though my history books, as we were talking earlier about the way history that's taught in the schools isn't accurate, my history books, you know, the version of history in my history books was racist toward African American people, but also toward indigenous people, because it's as if they no longer were part of, you know, part of life, basically. So, you know, I have my childhood memories, but they're extremely complicated now, for which I'm grateful, because, you know, when you're a child, you see through a glass darkly, but when you're a grown-up, you should see face to face, as my preachers used to tell me when I was growing up, even though they were not doing it themselves. I took it seriously as I grew up, though.
But, you know, so as reading about your career and what you've done and your life professionally and the contributions that you've made and will continue to make, obviously, your role as a writer and an activist and a thinker and an educator over the years. Where do you think in your childhood, who were the biggest influencers on you to have the strength that you have, or that you've exerted in those particular areas? Who are the artists? Who are the activists? Who are the writers in your life as a child?
Well, you know, the wherewithal to face reality came in very oblique ways. You know, I was born in 1946, so I'm about to be 75, and I was raised absolutely under segregation as a white girl to be a segregationist and a racist, absolutely. So when I was growing up, all the voices that were dominant, that were almost without a break, were all the voices of racism. I mean, everybody, right? My mother, my father, my preachers, all my teachers, the mayor, the publisher of the newspaper, everything that was on the radio. I think if people need an analogy, you have to imagine that you're living in the Trump era and you never hear anything else. That was what it was like to be me growing up. And then there would be these every once in a while, very, very rarely, there would be something like my mother saying, well, you have to do what's right no matter what other people think. She would say that to me, right? Now, what her idea of right was and my idea of right diverged considerably as the years went on, but she did teach me that. And I would tell her that when she reprimanded me later in life, right? And then I had one teacher, one person who was my adult youth leader in my church. And she sort of took me under her wing and introduced me to literature, introduced me to Chaucer, to some other literature, but she never talked to me about anything political, ever. I later found out that she was one of Harper Lee's two friends, the ones that are in To Kill a Mockingbird. She was one of them, disguised as a boy in the book. She was Harper Lee's closest friend and had a whole secret history of her own that she never told me anything about, right? So whatever I got, I absorbed under the radar, and I didn't even understand what it was until later. The thing that sprung me out of it all was going off to grad school in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And there was the women's liberation movement there. So it was my peers who I was married by that time. I had two little children. I had one of them while I was in grad school, one right before I went into grad school, one while I was in grad school. And I was frightened of the ideas. The women's liberation had a cardboard table out in front of the undergraduate library. And I remember I would cross the quad area so that I wouldn't go by it. Mm-hmm. But I ended up being office mates with one of the women's liberationists. You know, they just put us in offices, helter-skelter. And she just sort of worked on me, gave me things to read. Robin Morgan's Sisterhood is Powerful. I still have the copy that she gave me. The other women began organizing because the wages were unequal. And they made me part of a delegation because I was so, heterosexual and respectable. I had these children. I was, and that was a really moment of revelation. It was just me and one other woman, Linda Pannell. And we were sitting at the desk with the chair of the English department, and we were saying, and these are our demands: equal wages, equal number of instructors, blah, blah, blah. We were making our demands. And he was just sitting there sort of fiddling with his pen, and I looked at his hands, and they were shaking. They were shaking. He was afraid or nervous or unsure. And I thought, oh, and it's just the two of us. Right. So there were a lot of things, but they weren't political lessons out of my childhood, and it wasn't from artists. It was, and I'll tell you the other thing out of my childhood. I remember on the news, all the commentators were white segregationist voices on the local news, but sometimes they showed news clips. And I remember seeing a news clip of the Freedom Riders near Anniston, where the bus was stopped. It was to break the interstate segregation laws. That was what the Freedom Riders were about. And they got on a Greyhound bus and they rode all over the South. And in Anniston, Alabama, they were stopped by the Klan, and the bus was firebombed, and the people inside were beaten almost to death. And the police stood there and watched it, right? And the film and the clip is shown on television. And I saw that. And I knew Anniston because my cousin Ann lived there, and I would spend summers with her in Anniston. So it was a real place to me.
Yeah. And
it was really happening. And I knew it was wrong It was so wrong. You saw these people staggering off the bus, bloody, and the police just standing there, and the Klan, raving. And so it was the contradiction. Every once in a while, a contradiction would slip through. But I tell people now, it was the closest to living under fascism. It was a fascist enclave, the South was, within the US, because if you had any kind of public meeting challenging the segregation status quo, people would come and beat you up and try to kill you for it.
Yeah. And it was acceptable practice. And it's sort of interesting when you think about the pockets of fascism that we have today.
Yes.
2021, and of course it's a very different world. It's not necessarily geographic, but to some degree it is geographic. But I have to, maybe this is me being the optimist about all this stuff, but even in the deepest of the reddest pockets and the reddest families and the most Trump people out there, I want to believe that there are young people or also elders like us who, despite all of the chest beating that goes on and all of the hateful and nasty language, that there's somebody who is advising somebody else or helping someone else to say just what you said in the beginning of all this, which is do what's right. Because that's actually where this all started, which is the fact you heard that. Somebody said, even though they could have been, by our definition today, a dyed-in-the-wool racist and segregationist, but they still wanted to teach do what's right. And I have to believe today that even though there are people doing things that many of us don't agree with, they're hopefully surrounded by somebody who is still trying to internally preach that important lesson, which is do what's right.
I absolutely see. I think if you think about organizing at the most human level, the reason that something got through to me was that people were organizing. African American people were leading and breaking through and dying for it and liberating themselves and others along with that. It was not their goal to liberate me. I had to do my own struggle, but I saw them, and I think we can look at, there are these moments now that are very difficult. On the other hand, in my organizing circles, people say when there's a backlash, it means that you've been moving forward.
Yes.
And so we're having these, like you said, pockets of backlash or these moments of backlash. That element is organizing also. It's our job to do what you're doing and what I'm doing, which is to organize our own path and share it with others. And I know, because I've lived long enough, it makes a difference. I have seen it make a difference in my own lifetime. And we forget, if we don't have that long view, if we're just looking at the moment, that's true. But it's the change, collectively wrought change, I could never have imagined by myself.
Right, and that's absolutely right. And the thing is too, I find, this is kind of a constant thing that I say, we're the adults now. We have nobody else to blame except ourselves at this point. And it's not just people who are in their 60s and 70s at this point. It applies to people who are in their 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s. They can actually affect change. So much of what actually that we've seen, that we grew up with, is like, well, this was someone else's idea that was placed on top of us, whether it's sexism or racism or anything else like that. And you know what? It's on us to actually educate people. And of course, for activism, I think education is one of the most important things. It's having the facts, but then it's also communicating those facts as well too. And it's our job to, I think it's our job to use our power in our experience to kind of get that out there, and also try to empower other people and younger people to say, you know what, you can make a difference, you can make a change in this whole process.
Absolutely.
You don't have to take what your parents had told you, and it doesn't mean you don't love them, but it means that you have the power to make change, because we've all come from places, I think, which are a bit different. So how many books do you have out? I want to say, what, 9?
I think this one is 10, if you count all the chapbooks and other things. Yeah, I think Magnified is 10. Yeah, I love this book.
It's a beautiful, beautiful book.
It's a beautiful book. They did a beautiful design job. And also, I don't know, I'm the closest to it. It's sort of like you're, the baby, you're the fondest of the baby. It's the most recent one.
You and I were talking, and I asked you, is there anything that you would change about it? And it's lovely to hear you say no. It's lovely to hear you feel like it's a complete process. And for those of you who don't have it, of course, the book is called Magnified, and you can get it anywhere. You can probably find it in your local library if you want it. You can go to an independent bookstore and you can get a copy of it as well too. And Minnie Bruce is going to be doing some readings from it tonight. But so let's talk a little bit. So let's talk about your life now. You've had a partner for a number of years, and so I don't know where to start there with Leslie. How did you meet? What's going on?
Oh yeah, ask me. Yes. I always like for people to ask me how we met. We were together when she died in 2014. We had been together for 22 years. And we met in 1992 she was speaking in Washington, DC. It was a slide, she was touring with a slideshow that was the sort of like the visual draft of a book that she later did called Transgender Warriors, which was a book of personal stories and also history about how people didn't start as people in a either or male-female system that had evolved really quite a lot later in human history. And so she talks about that, how we were at the beginning, how it came to be this straitjacket on us. And then what you were saying, how all along there's been resistance to that. It's not just us. There's always been resistance to being thrust into either male or female, and also into either or sexuality. Anyway, she was touring with this slideshow, and it was right when there was a lot of ferment in the lesbian community around gender and sexuality. There are a lot of stories about that. We do not have time for them now. Just to say, there was a lot of to do. And so she was speaking, and the entire Washington, D.C., it felt like the entire Washington, D.C. lesbian community was there. So it was quite an occasion. She started by reading the opening chapter from Stone Butch Blues, which is called Letter to a 50s Femme, which is a letter of a butch lover to their femme lover. A very moving letter. And I remember vividly, just hearing her voice and looking at her and thinking how that was my life that she was reading. And then I left early. I mean, she did her very, very interesting talk. I left early because one of my ex-lovers was there trying to catch my eye, and I had to get out of there. I didn't want to talk to them. And then later, the next day, Leslie called and left a message on my phone saying that she knew I was there. She had seen me, and that it was very moving to her that I was there, and that began our correspondence. So I'll read. So part of what this book is these moments from our life, mostly from much later, when she was ill.
Mhm.
But this is the poem about when we met, and it starts with us standing on our porch here in Syracuse in the apartment, looking out, and how it reminded me of meeting her. And it's called Blue Moon. The trees creak overhead, squeaky doors pushed forth and back in the wind. On the porch, we watch the moon rising from whisper to guess to peach, white, then blue. Once in a blue moon, a love like this comes along. We weren't standing alone, lots of people, a room vast with politics and that ex-lover playing Catch My Eye. You read us a story, the one who had been you, a past, the one who had been me. Your torn shirt, my needle's eye. We had been alone. We had read what the other had asked. The light shone on the pages, your face up tilted in the glare. Gory mirror future. Later, I knew you were looking up at me. I knew you. You knew me. We looked at each other, shining on each other, shining on sun, sailing on moon.
It's so wonderful in this book that there's so many wonderful romantic pieces. And so, of course, we've been talking about Leslie Feinberg. How many years did you guys have together?
We had 22 years, and in that process, we both wrote, I don't know how many books. We worked all the time. We talked all the time. We loved each other all the time. It was shining on sun, sailing on moon the whole time. It really was. And I should tell people right now while I'm thinking about it. Of course, Leslie's best known for Stone Butch Blues, which was her groundbreaking novel. And I'm saying her preferred pronouns were her and here and she and Z. And I use her just because that's what we used with each other.
Sure.
Anyway, that book is available free download.
Oh,
The
nice.
the 20th anniversary edition with lots of extra material in it and photographs and the novel. It's all available as a free download if you go to Leslie Feinberg, all one word, .net. And it's also available for like $10 on Lulu because it's no profit. These were Leslie's wishes. She and I worked really hard to get it going before she died, and then I finished the task. So both the physical book, there's no profit involved. It's only the production cost of printing it through Lulu, and then free download. Plus there are continuing translations going up of the novel. There's one in Basque, there's one in French. There's about to be one that goes up in Spanish. So I hope people can access her work that way.
That's wonderful, and thank you for your generosity and actually the role that you've played in trying to be able to facilitate making that work available to everybody, particularly as it's being made in other being made available in other languages and translations as well too. Leslie, of course, for many people was a pioneer in a lot of their writing, and so it's wonderful to have this work available. And hopefully, I'm sure this is probably the case, but there's probably a whole new generation of the people that are discovering their works.
Yes, absolutely. I hear from them frequently, and they're discovering our generation. Really, they're going to the internet and researching us.
Absolutely right.
And I'm very happy about that. My grandchildren included in this as well. They say to me, when I say, how did you know that? They said, I looked it up.
Google you, Grandma.
That's it. Exactly.
That's what they get to do. So let's talk about some of your writing and sort of poetic influences. And tell me who some of your favorite poets have been over the years.
It has changed year by year, depending on what I'm working on. Because I read to help myself understand what I'm doing. So, for instance, I did a book, the book before this one was called Inside the Money Machine. And I started thinking about that book after I read the Communist Manifesto. I read it very late in life because, of course, I was brought up in the anti-communist South. I read it, and the thing that I noticed about it that no one, I'd heard all this red baiting stuff about it. Nobody told me it was so beautifully written. It's so full of the most amazing language, poetic language that also illuminates, right? So when I was working on that book, the Inside the Money Machine, I said to myself, well, if economists can write like poets, what happens if a poet tries to write about economic issues, meaning people working and what happens to us in this world, right? So I started writing these poems, but part of writing them was that I went to the poets of the 1930s, Langston Hughes, one of them, Muriel Rukeyser, also. Those were two that had a big impact on me because I wanted to see how they were a generation that was of poets before the McCarthy era hit, who wanted to write about, who did write about social conditions, about racism, but also about class struggle. So I read in them and then others as well. So it just really varies. Right now, I'm going back and I'm reading. For instance, I'm reading Marilyn Hacker, who was who was awarded the Lamont Prize, which you get for your best second book of poetry in the U.S. The American Academy of Poets gives it. And she received that for her second book of poetry. She is a lesbian, and I believe she was a lesbian when she got the award. But I think it wasn't done I think she wasn't living in a way where that was part of her public persona. I received the award for Crime Against Nature, which is about losing custody of my children because I was a lesbian. So that's part of that change that we've been talking about. There was really only about 10 or so years between Marilyn and me. But in that time, we changed the world enough that I could be an out lesbian and have written that book. I'm going back and I'm reading Marilyn's work, which is brilliant and fascinating. She translates a lot of work out of French and French Arabic writers, French writers who are either Arab or Muslim from the colonized areas. And she also writes about aging and being ill and being alone. So I've been reading her along with, finishing this book for Leslie, which is about grieving, losing someone you love. And of course, earlier I had read the gay male poets who'd written about losing their love during the AIDS epidemic. Paul Monette, very big influence on me with his writing as well. So, it just depends on what I'm working on, what I'm reading, or what I did read. And those who wrote about losing people that they love in different ways, right? Through exile. I've been reading a lot of writers from Iraq and from Palestine, and from an exile, poets in exile, because that's about losing the place you love, you know. So, and also, you know, a lot of them are socialist and political poets. And so it's interesting to me to see how they write personally, but still retain a political perspective. And yet it's what you're saying earlier, like, how do we write about our political struggles that reveals our full humanity? It's not rhetorical. It's about the grief and the joy and the knowing what is happening in the world and having it happen to us. And I'm hoping that that Magnified, you know, now that we've lived through this year of COVID and so many people have lost people, and it's not over. Clearly, it is not over. People are still getting sick, either dying or having long-term, you know, impact. I'm hoping that Magnified will really speak to those people who might not think they identify with a trans person, or who might not think they identify with a lesbian, or, you know, my life, but they have lived through this grief and what it means to live with someone you love who's very, very sick and disabled, and yet be full of joy because they're with you. They're still with you, you know, and getting the joy out of that. So I'm just, I don't know, it's my, you know, my small offering to us being able to stay alive and help each other.
And it's so beautifully said and so amazing. I mean, the sentiment is just so deep. It's, you know, you made me think about my own partner of 29 years and thinking about the idea that, sure, I mean, you know, mortality is mortality, and certainly something can happen when a couple ages. And again, it's why I was attracted a lot to this book, in the sense that, you know, there is loss in this book, and there is a lot of searching and water and different things and different ideas that are there. And I think it's I was very moved about it, because that is a fact of life, that this change is going to be there, and I think that we have to find it in any way that we possibly can. When you started your career as a poet, did it feel hard? Did it feel easy? Did it feel like, gee, all these older guys, you know, all these older men, how do I break into this machismo? You know, when you started, who were some of the big players in the field at the time?
Well, you know, you're right in that when I first started, which was in college, right? All the poets were men. I was in, you know, I was at the University of Alabama. Of course, there were poets that were women, but no one told me about them, right? So I really couldn't call myself a poet for quite a long time because of that. And it was really in parallel to the story I told earlier about the movement liberating me, literally saving me, the Black civil rights movement cracking that, you know, that racist mindset. At the same time, when I was at in Chapel Hill, women's liberation was emerging, and not just the political struggles, you know, which were very real and on the ground, but there was also culture that was emerging at the same time. And so I began to read the poets who were publishing, Robin Morgan, Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde and Robin Morgan were the first two poets, women poets, I ever heard read their work aloud.
Oh, interesting.
I went to a National Organization for Women conference in Philadelphia, and they were part of the program, you know, the cultural program. Robin read, and I knew her work, and Audrey read, and I had never heard of her. And then it was like a lightning bolt. I mean, it was because it was just the beginning, right? And I mean, not for her, obviously, but in terms of uh, her being part of, part of this sort of larger visible movement that was about women's liberation. And then that was my movement.
Mm.
In other words, I was a poet inside that movement. We were, it's something that people really don't know about, although you referenced it, I think, in your writing to me. It was happening everywhere, all over the world, right? But what would happen in your community, like I was part of this seminary collective that's part of your collection. In North Carolina, we did a literary magazine that was first a community newsletter, and then it turned into a literary journal. When we took our prepared material to the printer to be printed, they wouldn't print it because it was lesbian and therefore pornographic.
Right.
The printers refused to print it. And that was happening all over the country. So what happened is we started the Women in Print movement it started in 76, and then I came into it right about that time, where you won't print us? Well, people are going to go learn how to print. And they did. 2 people in my collective went and apprenticed and learned how to be printers. You won't publish it? We'll publish ourselves. My first book was self-published on the equipment in a warehouse in Carrboro, North Carolina, that belonged to Lollipop Power, which was out of a other feminist collective. They would publish the first non-sexist children's book in the U.S., Lollipop Power. And they had all this equipment because they were printing the books too. So they let us use their printer and their trimmer, which was like a guillotine. You didn't want to get caught in it, you would die. That was it's like, then it wasn't a strange thing to be a poet. You were a poet with all these other people being poets, and it was part of a political movement too. So it wasn't just about like me, me, me. It was like us. It was us.
Yeah, and of course, to be able to be an artist in that environment is just a wonderful way. And in a funny way too, what you're describing is not dissimilar to what we're seeing today in many queer groups of individuals, mostly in urban settings, but also what's happening in rural settings as well too. And in some ways, it's happening even more in rural settings because people are just finding each other, and they're finding support, and they're finding ways that the establishment is not going to support them. And so they're finding ways of getting their work together and getting it out and getting it prepared. And there was certainly something where, to be legitimized within the writing or the art world, you had to have an agent, you had to have a legitimate publisher and all that stuff. But you were at a period of time in which you would self-publish things because that's all that would happen. But then, of course, your work moved to the point where there were maybe major publishers that were involved in it. But then the publishing world has changed a tremendous amount in the last 5 or 10 years. And I do think that this movement, there was a fair amount of disrespect or disregard of the people who were self-publishing 10 years ago. But now there's really good work that's coming out because the economics of the market have really not given them a market.
Yep. Yes, absolutely. And, it's something we saw with the Women in Print movement. And Leslie, Leslie was trained as a Marxist to do Marxist analysis. And, this is not some mysterious thing. You look at all the factors and you look at them, fully, and you look and see like what direction things are going in. And when we were at that stage in the women in print movement where there were feminist publishing houses and distribution networks and bookstores, Leslie said, this is wonderful and it's going to last only so long because the market forces are going to bring themselves to bear on this, and the small businesses aren't going to be able to survive. They're going to be, and of course it happened right about in the time span that she predicted that it would. But now you're right. So now there's like another turn of the wheel, right? And thank goodness people are not like leaving themselves sort of in bondage to, you know, these voices of judgment and the people who have the, you know, big money. It's like, it's really important for people to take, you know, courage from that we can have that what fed us in my earlier movement can happen again and is happening. And for people to really, I don't know, find a lot of joy in that, because I know that with the coming of social media, I found it just this wonderful connection to people on social media where I can just put my work up and get response and conversation with them without having to wait, you know, for somebody to say, oh, that's a good poem, you know.
Exactly right. You don't need the approval of the establishment. And of course, and so much of that establishment is so tied to traditions about academia and institutions and money and wealth and credentials and all those things. I would love to hear another poem.
Yes, I mean, if we're speaking of sharing directly, this is the time, right? I've got several that are short, and I know we're coming to the end of our time, so I'll read 3 of them.
Great.
And to just give folks a feeling of the arc of the book. This one's called Hourglass. Hourglass, Hourglass. All night the wind throws sleet against the glass, like the sand stinging our faces and hands, the day the hurricane's tail end lashed us at the beach. Time tumbles us back and forth in its giant hourglass. One night at the beginning, you stood naked in the hall. It was storming outside the window, lightning, hail. You flicker into light, arriving before me once, again. Time rattles at our window, time trying to get in. And then this one is from later in our time together, Leslie and me. And she was.
Can I stop you for a second though? That last phrase, and time rattles at our window trying to get in. So was that toward the end of your time with Leslie?
No. It, you know, she was sick for a really long time. She had Lyme and co-infections and undiagnosed because it happened in, you know, she was probably infected in the 70s. You know, nobody knew anything. And she was trans. And so when she would try to get medical help, she was met almost always with disbelief that there was anything wrong, or she was called, you know, mentally unbalanced. Yeah. Now, the trans oppression made it worse. So she was off and on, I would say, except for she was sick when we got together. We didn't know it, but she got sicker within 3 years of our being together. And then all the rest of our time together, there were just long periods where she was very sick, including times when we thought she would die. So very early on in our relationship, the time was a factor.
Yeah.
Would we have time?
Yeah, and it's so clear in that poem, and particularly that last that last phrase that is so much that even though in that particular case it wasn't toward the end, but at least it reflects an awareness of an
Right.
end at some point.
And we talked we began to speak together very early on about mortality, very early, because within 3 years there was something that happened that we thought she was going to die from it. So we dealt throughout our relationship with the fact of mortality. And she had dealt with this herself, and I believe spoke clearly on this in public, that as a trans person, she hadn't thought that she would reach the age of 30 because of so many attempts on her life in one way or another. So she said to me once, she never said goodbye to someone she loved without telling them she loved them, because she didn't know if she would see them again. So that was just part of our relationship. And I do not believe that this is exceptional.
Yeah.
For people who are partnered with a trans person or who are trans, you know what it's like. Yeah. So the illness intensified that, but it was not the first shadow, right? So this is toward the end. Waiting for the ferry. And I'm thinking actually in this poem about an actual ferry crossing in my river I belong to in Alabama, the Cahaba, that I went to as a child, and I still go to. It's an iconic place for me. And then I brought that to this poem, Waiting for the Ferry. There's a place where the road drops down to the river. People waited there for the ferry once, for someone to come. Now we're going down together. At night, the trees are all darker shades. The night sky makes the river silver. You've never seen that road. I've never made this crossing. The limestone shoals stick up in the water, sharp as your bones under your skin. You need me to help you stand up or sit in smaller and smaller places. The bed, no bigger than a rowboat. And of course that evokes the ferry, the Charon's ferry that takes you into the underworld and all the myths. I just want to close with this one because I don't want people to be left with the feeling that even though it was a terrible loss for both of us, for Leslie and for me, the understanding that we can keep going forward together was always there. Mm. So this is the only poem in the book that I wrote after she died. The foreword. How we have to go over and over things, repeat beaten path, repeat to bury or uncover. The same story told to the same person again, again, again. Yet another of these poems about death. Yes, again. Survival by repetition, the effort behind the smell of cut grass, the swing back, the push, the crisscross of dying blades, you and me lying down on the grass after that long, hot march, hand in hand on the cool ground, and then pain, our muscles seized to the bone. We almost can't get up, but we do. Pain and the body's memory, the going on of all the other marches, the forward.
Unbelievable. So powerful. The book is Magnified, and it's just been absolute delight to have you here. And so I'll say what I said off camera, which is that I hope next time you are on your way south that you come and visit us at the Stonewall National Museum and Archive. I'd love to show you some of the stuff that we have from the American South and get your read and your take on it. It would be great.
I would love to come visit, and I'd probably come by way of Atlanta. I just want people to know, please remember our feminist bookstore in Atlanta, Karis Circle. They have autographed copies of this if people want to get it that way. I'd come by way of Atlanta and I'd come your way. And I don't know if I'd be able to tear myself away from the archives. You may have me longer than you anticipate.
We have a guest room and you're welcome to stay anytime. We're getting lots of great comments in here and the people have just thoroughly enjoyed it. And so just remind people, this is all being recorded. It will be up on our website. Give us about 2 days to get it up. Please feel free to share it. We've been on Facebook with all this stuff. And so, Minnie Bruce, thank you. It's just been so great to meet you.
I loved it, Hunter. Thank you for asking me. Thank you for being there.
Oh, happy to be here. And I look forward for you and I to work together in person.
Sounds good. All right. Bye, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.